certainly share the concern of my friend and colleague from Colorado and thank him for his clever remarks on that. We do, as an institution, have an alarmingly low approval rating. I've often said that we're slightly less popular in America than the Castro brothers and slightly more popular than the influenza virus, but the virus is gaining on us rapidly. There are many reasons for this. One of them, I think, has to do with the fact that we just control too many aspects of the lives of the American people. There's so much of what the American people do that is governed, even micromanaged, by the federal government and by what it does every single day. So much of their wealth has to go to pay their taxes to the federal government. So many of their communications are potentially susceptible to being monitored. So much of what they do is in one way or another restricted by the federal government. I'd like to discuss an amendment that I've proposed, Amendment number 1207, that would address one of the many implications of the fact that we have a federal government that is simply too big. And it deals specifically with the ownership of federal land. Now, in my state, the state of Utah, the federal government owns about 2/3 of the land. That's 2/3 of the land that has to be managed by bureaucrats, bureaucrats ultimately working out of Washington, D.C., who for the most part don't tend to share the same values or the same interests in land development as people from my own state do. That's land that we can't tax and land that we therefore can't access as a resource. It's land that, because it can't be taxed, cannot provide tax revenue for local governments to fund fire departments, police services, and schools. It has other implications, too, when the federal government owns this much land. You know, it's significant that about 40% of the land along our border is owned by the federal government. And it's significant that along a lot of that stretch of border, federal agents from the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, are not allowed to do their job. So even our own federal officers sometimes can't do that which they really need to do, that which they've sworn an oath to do, at least not very effectively, for the simple reason that this is federal land and that there are a whole host of environmental restrictions that often accompany the use of federal land or traversing on federal land of any kind. And again, this is foreign to many of my colleagues here, many of whom come from states where there's very little federal land. It's significant that in every state in the Rocky Mountains or west of the Rocky Mountains, the federal government owns 15% or more of the land in those states. And in every state east of the Rocky Mountains, the federal government owns less than 15% of the land. And in many states, it's much less than that, in some cases less than 0.5%. And so I don't expect all my colleagues to sympathize with this immediately, but I would hope that in time, as they come to understand what we face in those states where there is this much land ownership, that they'd be sympathetic to this amendment. So the idea of this amendment is that we've got a problem. We've got a problem when CBP agents can't adequately enforce the law, can't adequately enforce the border and protect it for national security purposes and for immigration purposes alike, simply because of the fact that the land's federally owned and environmental restrictions get in their way and interfere with their ability to do that. The net result of this is not environmental protection, because as we've seen, in many of these areas, because coyotes and others who bring people illegally across the border are well aware of these restrictions, they'll make sure that illegal immigrants come across these very same tracts of land in order to get into the United States illegally. And they leave in their wake, in some cases, a trail of destruction, or at least a trail of litter, as they drop things along the way. This also, by the way, creates very dangerous conditions for many of these immigrants who are trying to cross very remote sections of land. And it makes it difficult not just for the agents, but also for the immigrants alike. It's not really good for anyone. So this amendment tries to change that, and this amendment would provide immediate access to land at the border for the purpose of maintaining or building roads, fences, also driving patrol vehicles, and for installing surveillance equipment. You know, it's interesting. People are dying on the border as a result of the fact that immigrants very often will cross these very remote sections of land. They run out of water, they run out of food, they run out of other supplies, they get lost, and it's scary. This would happen less if we were adequately enforcing our border. And again, borderlands are littered with the trash left behind, these illegally crossing illegal aliens. This has not gone completely unnoticed in the past. In fact, this has been reported in the press. Just a few years ago, the Washington Post reported, it was on November 16, 2009, the following, quote, in a remarkably candid letter to members of Congress, Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano said her department could have to delay pursuits of illegal immigrants while waiting for horses to be brought in so agents don't trample protected lands, and warns that illegal immigrants will increasingly make use of remote protected areas to avoid being caught. The documents also show that the Interior Department has charged the Homeland Security Department $10 million over the last 2 years as mitigation penalties to pay for damage to public lands that agencies say have been caused by Border Patrol agents chasing illegal immigrants. So look, every one of us in this body that I'm aware of has been saying we need to secure the border, and that we do. I'm here to reiterate that very point. If we're serious about that, as we claim to be, then we have a certain obligation to make sure that our CBP agents and officers have the ability to enforce the law, that they're not fighting this battle with one hand or perhaps both hands tied behind their back, that we're not ordering them to make bricks without straw. We've got to give them the ability to do their jobs and certainly not interfere with it. It's not just that we're placing a minor incidental burden on their ability to enforce the laws. We're talking here about 40% of the land along the southern border that is federally owned. So we're dealing with an awful lot of land. And everyone knows that if you enforce the border in some areas but make it impossible to enforce in others, you're going to drive the illegal immigration traffic toward those areas of the border where the enforcement is not ongoing. And so that's what my amendment does. This has been debated and discussed in the House of Representatives. My understanding is that in prior legislation, the House of Representatives has even adopted this provision. And I urge each and every one of my colleagues to take a close look at Amendment 1207, which I hope to call up in the near future, and I hope we will pass this measure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the floor.